Hello, we are In Conversation with the Sanford School, a podcast from the T. Denny Sanford School of Social and Family Dynamics at Arizona State University, designed to showcase timely and informative insights from leading faculty, researchers, and other experts which impact the ever-changing social world we live in. Here at the Sanford School, we recognize that the lands where we are hosting this conversation at Arizona State University belong to the Maricopa and Pima peoples, and we are privileged that we can welcome you to today's conversation. In today's podcast, we're excited to be in conversation with our local experts to discuss the topic of intersectionality. Our guests today include Dr. Eleanor Seaton, who studies racial discrimination and racial identity among African American and Caribbean Black youth, and Dr. Rocio Garcia, who engages in analyses of social action in 4 areas: social movements, reproductive justice, culture, and knowledge production. Dr. Seaton and Dr. Garcia, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here.
How you both
Thank
doing
you for
today?
having me, John. I'm happy to be here.
Well, good. We're recording here today. We're in the Valley of the Sun. It's really hot outside, so we're inside, and I'm glad you guys were able to carve some time out today to have this conversation, and we're looking forward to sharing that with our listeners. So why don't I get this started? I mean, the best question that I could possibly ask is for both of you, and it's just primarily, what is intersectionality?
So that's a great question, John. I think that's a great way to start, right? So for me, plainly speaking, intersectionality is a framework that operates as an analytical tool. It's a method, and it's a call to action to really make sense of the complexity that we know already exists in the world, in people, and in our experiences as humans. These complex dynamics, especially for me as a scholar of intersectionality, they help me understand the relations between various experiences and various systems of oppression, right? And essentially it's just based on the premise that oppressive ideologies and institutions, which include but are certainly not limited to racism, ageism, homophobia, sexism, they don't act independently in society, but they're actually very much interrelated. So because of these interrelations, different histories and contexts are making social relations and identities always very fluid, right? Always very context specific and changing.
Oh, that's incredible. I mean, it really is a wide topic that we need to be thinking about these days. Dr. Seaton, can you tell us a little bit more sort of about, how this all started?
Sure. Intersectionality originated in Black feminist scholarship. And the founder is a Black woman, Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. She's a law professor at UCLA and Columbia University. However, it's not only applicable for Black women, but I think it's important to note that it started in Black feminist scholarship. And one thing I want to add to Rocio's excellent definition is just the fact that intersectionality, while it talks about intersecting systems of power, it also means that individuals can be simultaneously advantaged and disadvantaged based on those systems of power. And I can talk more about that a little later, but that in essence, everyone has privilege and everyone has disadvantage depending on where they fall with these axes of power.
Wow. I mean, that certainly is a lot to think about, especially when day to day we're in our own bubbles. Okay. Wow. So what can you both tell us? Can you tell us a little bit more about intersectionality?
Absolutely. So I really, I appreciate what Eleanor is adding in terms of the importance of being specific about the origins, right? That this is very much rooted in Black feminisms. And I would definitely argue that the most influential contributions to intersectionality have been on the part of Black feminists specifically, right? I think it's, when we're thinking of distinguishing features, right, I think it's really important also to keep in mind the way that intersectionality has traveled in the academy, but also outside of it, that there are many different ways of thinking of intersectionality, right, and what it means to different people. For me, something really important that I always have to remind myself, and an early lesson I received, is the importance about, if we're talking about power and oppression together, that also means that intersectionality isn't an additive approach, right? So oftentimes, and I notice it when I teach intersectionality to students when it's their first time thinking about this, oftentimes people think of it as almost like a math equation, right? That if you have race, right, and you have gender, and you add it together, that's intersectionality, right? And often people think about it almost like if you're making a recipe, right, of someone's various identities, and they just kind of add in class identity or religion and things like that, but it's not actually intended to be an additive approach. It's not intended to be a mathematical equation, right? These intersections are always in societies. It's just how we're analyzing them. And sometimes you hone in on certain aspects over others, right, depending on the situation. But because intersectionality is often, I would say, misused as an additive approach as opposed to being a relational approach, which is what was actually intended, right, to be. It's important for me to always remind myself to think about the distinction between studying race versus studying racism, or studying gender versus sexism, right? The importance of always having power as central to analyses and intersectionality, right? That's one of the gifts that Black feminists and other feminists of color have given us through the creation of such a powerful concept, right? So I definitely, that's something that I reiterate when I'm teaching my classes and when I'm writing, right, to a broad academic audience or to an audience outside of the academy. Always the idea of, it's about relations, not about adding, right, identities, right? It's about relations to power. Eleanor, did you want to touch on some of the features as well as
No, I think I agree wholeheartedly. And I guess I would just want to maybe give an example. When you talk about the relation of power and the fact that people are simultaneously advantaged and disadvantaged, I find in my classes it's always helpful to just give an example of that. What does that mean to be simultaneously disadvantaged and advantaged? So I'll use myself. Well, first, as an American, we have passport privilege. As a heterosexual woman, I have sexual orientation privilege. Heterosexuality is the dominant sexuality in our current iteration of society. I also have a socioeconomic status privilege. I grew up middle class and I'm still middle class. However, I am a Black woman, so I am disadvantaged because of my race. That's, again, Black American. I'm the descendant of enslaved Africans. And also the fact that I'm a woman. I'm disadvantaged because of my gender. And so I just think, as we talk about this analytical framework, I always encourage my students to spend some time thinking about how they are advantaged and disadvantaged simultaneously. And those are just a couple of examples. We could think about other systems of power and where we fall in terms of thinking about a relation to who we are in those different systems of power.
That's incredible. Both of you, thank you for that summary and that insight. And Dr. Seaton, certainly that example, I hope that gives, well, it certainly does me, but our listeners, to what this means and how critical it is to think differently in terms of wearing the other shoe, so to speak. To know that you yourself can be advantaged and disadvantaged at the same time is something that's very thought-provoking, and it has got me thinking ever since I heard you mention it the first time. So thank you both for that. Dr. Garcia, I do have a question for you. How does intersectionality help us make sense of numerous dynamics in both, the current COVID-19 pandemic and the racial justice protests across the country that we're seeing today?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that, John. I think there's a lot of ways, right, that intersectionality can help us understand both the pandemic and also these protests around racial justice, and specifically the movement for Black lives, right? I think just to start off, it's really important for me in terms of when I mean, like all of us probably, we're reading the news, right, daily, if not more times, right, as things are always enveloping. But it's really interesting to me how if you just look at any news source, right, for me, it's often on my phone when I'm doing it, oftentimes the discussions about the pandemic and about Black Lives Matter are often talked about separately. I actually don't really see them as that separate, right? So there's so many ways where I'm seeing the intersections, right? In terms of demographics, an easy one is the fact that, for example, Black, Indigenous, and Latinx folks are much more likely, right, to be affected by COVID, right? And to not experience the best outcomes in terms of treatment and recovery, right? We're seeing this over and over again. But because I'm a scholar that's really interested in politics and also the framing of politics really generally, it's super interesting to me how, for example, these debates around wearing masks, for example, when folks, specifically white Americans, right, were protesting in various cities about protesting against lockdown, protesting against wearing masks and things like that. And for me, seeing the public response and also various police departments' responses to white people protesting versus when we started to see Black folks and allies, right, to Black folks protesting for racial justice, the responses by state and non-state agents were polar opposite, right? Like that was such a perfect moment to see the double standard, right? And the way that white supremacy is working every day in this country, right? The villainizing of Black folks when they're literally just saying like, our lives matter, right? And we deserve to have all of the resources necessary, right? To not just survive, but also thrive, right? And to see how differently so many people responded to white people, white conservatives, about their issues with the inconveniences, mild inconveniences, let's be honest, about masks versus what Black folks are asking about. That's such a perfect way to look at the intersections, right? How white supremacy, how anti-Black racism specifically is operating in discussions and the politics surrounding the pandemic and also these racial justice protests, right? And I can definitely elaborate on a lot of other ways that I'm seeing how intersectionality is just such a useful framework to understand everything that's going on right now. But that's just one of the ways. So.
Wow. I mean, yeah, it is such a, the touchy climate that we're in. And it is interesting now to look through this lens of intersectionality as we apply it to the news that's being reported. And I mean, it is very helpful now to have this background, to have an appreciation and understanding of what's happening and how the power is shifted in these cases. I've got a nice transitional question because, school's right around the corner. Kids are moving into campus here at ASU over the last couple of weeks, and we're really going to get back to it. And so I have a question, Dr. Seaton, for you. As we all return, what can students, faculty, and staff do in terms of applying intersectionality to their thinking?
That's a great question, John. And as Rocio alluded to, intersectionality has definitely entered popular discourse. But before I get to that, the main thing people can do is wear their mask, wash their hands, and watch their social distancing. As Rocio stated, COVID-19 has had a devastating impact on minority communities, the Black American community, the Native American community, the Latinx community. So anything that you can do to alter, reduce, or eradicate the spread of COVID-19 is not only is it anti-racist, but it's acknowledging the intersectionality and the intersectional impact of COVID-19. So that's the first thing. And you can do that right now, or as soon as you finish listening to this podcast. The next thing is I would encourage people to read the work of scholars who employ intersectionality. As I mentioned, it originated in Black feminist scholars. It did not stay in Black feminist scholarship or Black scholarship, but Read the work of Kimberly Crenshaw or Patricia Hill Collins or Rocio's work or my work or Philomena Essed, a brilliant psychologist working in the Netherlands. So I would say consume the work of women of color or scholars of color who use intersectionality appropriately. Everybody doesn't use it appropriately, so you have to be careful, but I would encourage people to consume that work. The second thing is to do what I did when I started off, is to analyze your advantage and disadvantage. Think about your relative privilege and your relative disadvantage. Understand where you fall in relation to these systems of power so you understand how this is operating. The next thing is probably going to be a little harder for some people, and that is to empower communities that are more marginalized than yourself. So I'll use myself as an example. As I said, I'm heterosexual, and that's privilege in our society because heterosexuality is considered the norm or the normative sexual orientation. That being said, though, I try to be an ally to the LGBTQIA community. I am not a member of that community, but I recognize that that sexual orientation is disadvantaging compared to mine. So I try to be an ally to that community, empower that community, and work to advocate for that community as a person who recognizes her relative privilege. This last assignment is probably the hardest because I think if we really want to talk about the end game for intersectionality, that's probably to eradicate all systems of power. And I think people need to get comfortable with losing privilege and power. Unfortunately, within the system of racism and white supremacy, we are fed this lie that this is a zero-sum game. If I lose, you win. If you win, I lose. When that's just not true. But people have to understand that the end game for intersectionality is the eradication for all of these systems of power. And that means you, depending on, again, on that axis of power, may lose power and privilege. And you have to be okay with that. You've actually got to welcome that, because I always go back to one of my sheroes, and that's Fannie Lou Hamer. And she was a civil rights activist in Mississippi. And she told us, no one is free until everyone is free. And so I would say to start there. COVID-19 guidelines, analyze your advantages and disadvantages. Think about your privileges or disadvantages. Read work by women of color or scholars of color who use intersectionality. Amplify communities that are more marginalized than the ones that you belong to, and contend with the fact that the end game means you would lose privilege and power, and be okay with that. Welcome that outcome, because that would mean that the most marginalized individuals in our society are protected and cared for. And if that happens, everyone is protected and cared for.
Thank you, Dr. Seaton, so much for sharing that. Again, it's thought-provoking once again. It's clear that we need to learn how to become uncomfortable to be comfortable. And that's going to take some work. But like you said, just like wearing masks, if we just do the little things, I think we can get there. So thank you for that. Dr. Garcia, I'd like to come back to you with a question. What are some ways that non-Black scholars can use intersectionality as a means to engage in anti-racist or anti-sexist work?
That's a great question. Thank you, John. So I think Eleanor has already outlined excellent steps, right, in terms of what we can do, right? So for me, in hearing her previous answer, I just kept thinking about accountability, right? A lot of what Eleanor is mentioning, the movement for Black lives, right? Black folks across time and space, right? Part of what they're asking for is for us to be accountable, right? How can we actually ever get to a point where we are in a position where these systems of oppression, right, are dismantled? We can't ever get to that point if we're not even first willing to acknowledge the harm that's being done, right? The violence that's being done in the past and still ongoing. So I'll tell you one way in terms of, in my research, how I try to explore some of this accountability, right? So in my more theory-driven work, I unpack some of the messiness in ideas from and about Latinxes, right? So one of the things that I love about intersectionality is just its ability to help us unpack the messiness in real life, right? Real life is messy, right? Social dynamics are messy, people are messy. We already know this, right? But intersectionality is a framework that's actually intentional about centering that messiness, right? Getting into the nuances that sometimes we're not able to get to through other frameworks, right? So for me, obviously, I care in terms of the mission of intersectionality about social justice, but I'm also mindful about, for example, when I'm talking about Latinx feminisms, which is my area of expertise, and I'm talking about justice, I want to complicate what I mean by justice and for whom when I'm talking about Latinxes, right? So for me, it's a really interesting epistemological but also empirical question that I ask myself, that the reality is that Black, Indigenous, feminist, and queer people of Latin American descent, have done so much political work, right, to unpack nuances that haven't been unpacked, to fight for justice, right? And yet, when most people think about Latinxes or Latinos or Hispanics or whatever term you want to use, most of the time these people are not the people that folks are thinking about when they hear Latinx, right? When people hear Latinx or Hispanic, oftentimes they're thinking about folks that look like me or some variation of me, right? They're not thinking about the many Black and Indigenous folks, right, throughout Latin America, right, that are also here, who matter in this, right? Who matter when we're thinking about Latinx. We need to get a lot more messier and expansive in terms of thinking about that. But it's not just about widening the picture of who Latinxes are. It's also getting at the power dynamics between Latinxes, right? I know that the average white American in this country doesn't see me as one of them, right? I'm not treated on a daily basis as a white American in that sense. They don't see me as one of them. But I know that every day my light skin affords me privileges that a Black person, whether Black American or Black Latinx, right, in any way, I experience a lot of privileges relative, right, to that. And I'm trying to unpack, right? What does it mean then for ideas about Latinxes? What does it mean for organizing social movements? What does it mean for theorizing Latinx politics if we're not theorizing these, what I would say, massive erasures, right? These forms of unpacking how anti-Blackness is very much alive among non-Black Latinxes, right? How anti-Indigenous sentiment is also very much alive, right, in these communities. And it's not just Latinxes, right? To be clear, this is where I specialize, but I'm certainly not saying that it's just Latinxes that have a problem with anti-Blackness, right, or anti-Indigeneity. This is across groups, right? It's just, for me, part of my mission in honoring the work that Black feminists have done is putting the mirror towards myself, right, and my community, right, of what's the work that's still left to be done, right, to really develop fluid, right, radical politics around Latinx feminisms that are actually very much in line with what Black folks are saying, what Indigenous folks are saying, right? Like, how do we start to rebuild movements that are very much engaging in this kind of solidarity work as opposed to the more commonplace erasures tactics? Right. So I think in terms of what the rest of us that are not Black, right, can do, is just, again, how can you incorporate these ideas of solidarity and accountability into your research, right? How can you theorize and develop data collection plans that are much more in line with these erasures that are already happening in the academy, right? Actually really looking at the academy itself as a site of white supremacy, right, as a site of patriarchy. So then what does that mean for the knowledge, right, that's being developed, and for the knowledge that we have an opportunity to rebuild, right, or reimagine as we move forward? So I would think that that's one big way, right? Think about in your research, how can you really be in solidarity, right, with, like Eleanor said, folks that are relationally more marginalized than you are.
Yeah, I mean, I do have a closing question, but you know, for someone that sits in my seat, it seems like we've done a lot of work, but we have so much more to do. It's mind blowing. So, thank you for your comments, Dr. Garcia, and for the great work and research that you're doing. And I'll kind of, you know, wrap up our time together with a question to Dr. Seaton, which is piggyback to what you've already been discussing, but I'd love your thoughts, Dr. Seaton, on how can intersectionality impact research? So tell us, give me some thoughts on that.
I think Audre Lorde said, there's no single issue. We don't live single issue lives because all issues are connected. Even though our disciplines like to pretend things are siloed, they're not. And so every research agenda is impacted by and should use intersectionality. So Rocio mentioned the George Floyd incident that happened in May. And, the George Floyd murder brought police brutality back into the public consciousness and has launched this racial reckoning, if you will. But the way police brutality historically has been spun is that it's an issue that primarily affects minority men and primarily Black men. And that's just not true. Kimberly Crenshaw, the founder of Intersectionality, started a hashtag and a podcast, Say Her Name, to bring attention to the fact that Black women are also likely to be victims of police brutality. And we know because the Breonna Taylor incident became widely publicized. And so every issue is impacted by intersectionality. Whether someone is discussing it or not, that's just simply the truth. And police brutality is the issue that we're still talking about as a result of George Floyd. I want to give another issue that's closer to my area. I'm a developmental psychologist by training, and in developmental science, a real hot topic is bullying. Bullying occurs in elementary, middle school, high school, even adults report being bullied. And a couple of years ago, I had a colleague who wanted me to work on a paper with him. He's a big-time bullying researcher. And he had collected some school-wide data, and he wanted to see if we could write a paper together. And the school where he collected the data included Black American students, white American students, and Latinx students. So it was ethnically and racially diverse. Well, as I'm wont to do, I started asking some questions about bullying. And I had to explain to him, being bullied, for example, by a white person is a very different experience than being bullied by a Black person or a Latinx person. What if you are the offspring of undocumented immigrants? That's going to be very different. What if you're a member of the LGBTQ community? That's going to be very different. What if you're low income? That's going to be very different. What if you're bullied by someone in your ethnic racial group as opposed to in another ethnic racial group, as opposed to a member of the dominant racial group? So I had all these questions for him that he could not answer. And I said, well, you really need to adopt an intersectional lens because you think you're studying bullying, but you really aren't, because you really haven't unpacked the nuance behind bullying, because bullying also is linked to power, just like racism or sexism or classism or any of the isms that we've talked about and haven't really named. And so any issue requires intersectionality. Now, for those people listening, that doesn't mean that you've listened to this podcast and now you're an expert on intersectionality and you can go out and apply it to your topic. No. You should find someone who is an expert on intersectionality, like Rocio, like myself, and invite them to join your project as a co-I so that your project can be informed by an intersectional perspective. And you can absolutely answer the questions that you want to answer and also provide nuance. And the last thing I want to say to this, related to that, the need to work with scholars who use an intersectional lens. Because of COVID-19 and because of the George Floyd murder, the ground beneath us has literally shifted, right? We are in the midst of a reckoning, whether we know it or not, whether we like it or not, whether we want to be or not. The ground has shifted. And I think the question that our colleagues should answer for themselves, well, where do you want to be when the dust settles? Do you want to be on the right side of history? Or do you want to be where you've always been, which is probably on the wrong side of history? So recognize that the ground has shifted, but you have a chance to take your research to the next level. So it's not an option to incorporate intersectionality. It's a necessity. And again, that's going to determine where you stand when the dust settles. And I think it's a question that people need to think about. Where do you want to be, on the right or the wrong side of history? Because intersectionality is absolutely on the right side of history. And these conversations are not going to go away. They're going to become more nuanced, more intensive. And so people have a choice to make. I hope our colleagues and anyone listening makes the right choice.
Well, thank you. I wish I had an applause queued up in the back for you. First of all, I really appreciate your time having this conversation with us about intersectionality. I think it's vitally important to our culture. I think we now have opportunities to see life through a new lens through this discussion today, and take it all the way to research at the level that you are, and figuring out how to apply this more, and for scholars to have the ability to reach out to experts like you and other people that are experts with intersectionality to help or guide or improve their work. So, at the end of our show, I'll be sure that our listeners know how they can follow you on your social media handles and connect with you. So before we go today, I just wanted to open it up. Dr. Garcia, Dr. Seaton, do you have any final comments you'd like to make about intersectionality?
Eleanor, did you want to start off?
I feel like I said everything I need to say.
Yeah, it's been a comprehensive conversation today. There's no doubt.
Yeah, I mean, again, I just want to first just thank you, John, for inviting me. And it was such a pleasure to do this with Eleanor. Yeah, I think I just want to just really echo everything that Eleanor just said. And again, just the importance of listening, believing, citing Black women, right? Like, if anything, work on doing that, right, as a starting point. But just, again, just really listen. Like, even though Crenshaw officially coined this term in the 80s, intersectionality has existed long before, as Eleanor has said. Black women in particular have been telling us, right, and giving us this lens, right, giving us this gift is how I like to call it, right? So it is really on the rest of us who are not Black to think about what are we going to do with this gift, right? And how can we use it in a way that it still holds true to the origins, right, of Black liberation, right? And how do we still keep that as central, even if we're talking about non-Black communities, right? So again, I just want to thank you all, and Eleanor, it was such a pleasure to be on this podcast with you.
Oh my God, likewise. I always learn from Rocio whenever she opens her mouth. I don't know about anybody else. But I guess in closing, we are in a unique moment in history. I don't know when people will listen to this podcast, but this is the first day of the Democratic National Convention, and a historic thing happened last week. The Democratic presidential contender chose a Black woman and also an East Asian woman, an Indian American woman, let me get it right, to be his running mate. And that choice in and of itself is intersectional. Kamala Harris is an intersectional person. Her policies are infused with intersectionality. And I want people to have the nuance and the tough conversations that are sparked by that choice of a VP pick. And I think we are in a right moment. There is the opportunity for change if people take advantage of that. And I'm primarily talking about white Americans, because I find that those are the individuals who know the least about these topics and have the most learning to do. So I'm hopeful that they will take this moment to learn, to listen, and to amplify, and to think about what that means for our country going forward. In about 25 years, we will be a majority minority country. Regardless of the protestations, it's coming. It's probably going to happen sooner, but that's my opinion. So I just hope that our fellow friends who lack melanin take the time to do what this moment is calling for.
Well, Dr. Seaton and Dr. Garcia, thank you so much for being in conversation with us to discuss intersectionality. And we are so fortunate that you are both here in the Sanford School. Please continue the great work and research that you both do. And I hope we'll have you on our podcast again real soon.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks for
John.
having me.
Yes, thank you for having me. This was great.
Okay. Have a great day, you guys.
You too.
You too.
Be sure to follow today's guests on Twitter using their handles @Seaton Eleanor and @Rocio_R_Garcia. Connect with us and get access to all of our podcasts by visiting thesanfordschool.asu.edu/podcast, where you will also find links to all of our social media channels. This conversation has come to an end, but our work here continues.